Hi, welcome to North of 48. It is April the 15th. It's about 11 degrees Celsius up in the capital of Northern Canada. And I'm waiting for my tulips to still come out, and which is disappointing to me. But we are at day 783 of the Ukraine invasion, and Ann Lee's got a column in the Daily Costs entitled Russian Military is Leveraging Delays in U.S. Military Support. And we're at 192 days of the Israel conflict, which is now drug in Iran. Or were they part of it to begin with? We don't know. But our guest today is Paul Jay. He's in the house. And famed, I'm going to say famed or respected documentary person. Here's a couple of his return to Kandahar is especially poignant. And but Paul is a journalist, filmmaker, founder, editor-in-chief, and host of the Analysis.News, which you can find on YouTube. He was the founder, CEO, and senior editor of the Real News Network. He worked with Gore Vidal, among others, for the launch of the Real News Network, which included the documentary History of the National Security State. In this, Jay interviews Vidal, as well as Lawrence Wilkinson, Ray McGovern, and Antonia Juhas. The Real News went on to launch several internet video television news magazines, including the Empire Files, created in 2015 with Telesur, and for which Jay is an executive producer. He's also the executive producer of the 2017 Donald Trump, the Koch brothers, and their war on climate science. And he's a past chair of the Canadian Independent Film Caucus, and also a founding chair of the Hot Docs Canadian International Documentary Festival. He chaired the Hot Docs board for its first 5 years. And he was creator and executive producer of CBC News World's flagship debate program, Counterspin. It was broadcast from 1998 to 2004, and it was a prime-time debate show about news of the day. He's an independent journalist and documentary maker. Paul brings a wealth of experience and common sense about the conflicts in this world and is highly respected in his journalistic endeavors. Hi, Paul. How are you, sir?
I'm good. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, well, hey, it's been about a year and a half, I think, almost 2 years since we talked last, and that was very interesting. I sometimes look back at it, and I appreciate any time that you have to give to us. Just a guy trying to figure out what the world is about right now, and I appreciate any wisdom you might bring us. Daniel Ellsberg passed away this last year, and I wonder, what was your relationship with him? We talked a little bit last time you were on, but he was the author of the Pentagon Papers. And can you tell us a little bit about Daniel, because he had a penchant for he was a nuclear war planner at one time? Is that correct?
Yeah, he started off his sort of academic career at MIT. Now, I was on his path in his late 20s to becoming what a lot of people thought would be a Nobel Prize winning economist at MIT. In fact, he interrupted his studies to go join the Marines just after the Korean War, because he was such a hawk about U.S. foreign policy. He was a real Cold War hawk, and so much so that he went to fight. Originally, he thought he'd be sent to Korea, but he was actually sent to during the Suez Crisis. He was sent there. Then he went back to his studies. He was an academic star, but he got recruited by Rand Corporation, essentially to be a nuclear war planner when he was about 28, 29 years old.
Okay.
And he did it because he thought the United States was facing the possibility of another Pearl Harbor, and that would be a surprise Soviet attack on the United States. And so this is like 1959 or something like that. And in the course of his work for Rand, advising the highest levels of the American security state, the Pentagon, and even directly to the president, Kennedy, he started to find out that the whole story of the possibility of a Soviet surprise attack on the United States was essentially nonsense and had been made up. He came to the conclusion to justify a Cold War, which was used to justify a massive buildup of a nuclear weapons program and a buildup of the military-industrial complex. It took him a few years, step by step, to come to these conclusions. Eventually becomes the person that releases the Pentagon Papers to expose the lies of the Vietnam War. But he eventually comes to the conclusion that the Cold War was essentially a subsidy for the aerospace industry, which was a quote from him. I read his book a few years ago, and it scared the hell out of me, Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. And I contacted him. I did I think a 10-part interview series with him about the book. And then I had the idea to do a film based on the book, a feature-length documentary film. And that's what I'm working on now. It's going to be called How to Stop a Nuclear War. And the sort of subtitle is Dismantle the Doomsday Machine. It's going to be narrated by Emma Thompson.
We probably need that documentary more so nowadays than we have in the past. I think the doomsday clock is ticking up and moving closer to midnight.
Yeah, it's about 90 seconds. They kept it at 90 seconds this year for some reason. I don't know why, because I think it should have gone 75 at least. But
right. When do you expect this documentary to be finished or finalized, reviewed?
I'm guessing we're aiming to release it late August or early September of 2025.
Okay.
August will be 80th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Mm-hmm. So we might try to get it out for August, but it might be better August or September 2025.
All right. Well, I'm fascinated. I can't wait for that to come out.
And I'm guessing we will be not just, there might be some agreement by then in Ukraine, but we could be right in the midst of some great amount of tension over Taiwan.
Yeah, there goes the world. Well, let's skip right over, since we're talking about doomsday. Let's skip over to Israel. I am thinking Ukraine must be, kind of sad that Israel has this Iron Dome that has taken out 99% of the Iran drones that Iran unleashed, and Ukraine doesn't. I know Germany's giving 2 Patriot systems over to Ukraine, so that's good. What are your thoughts about the Middle East right now? Do you think between the Houthis, the people in Gaza, Hamas, and Iran, what are your thoughts there? Is there an end game there? I know what this Iran solution is as an end game, but do you think things will calm down? Or do you think it's going to ratchet up?
Well, I'm not sure what you think the end game for Iran is. The end game for the Iranian theocracy is pretty much the same as the end game of the Israeli theocracy / political economic elites, which is stay in power. Mm-hmm. Then they have the specificity. The agenda for the Israeli state and elites, especially this government, but not only, it's pretty much every government they've had and might have, is to maintain the supremacy of the Jewish state and to force the Palestinians into an unlivable situation. They still hope that the Palestinians in the West Bank will end up in Jordan. They still hope that the Palestinians in Gaza will somehow be absorbed into Egypt. And in the meantime, they'll make life as absolutely unbearable for these people as they can. It's obvious to anyone that looks at the situation. In fact, even Prime Minister Omar, former Prime Minister, said this. Hamas is to a large extent the actual creation of Israel. Israel had chances to negotiate with Fatah and others. There was quite a few, several important other organizations that
PLO. Yeah.
that were progressive, some of them were socialists, and they would have created a perspective for a whole different kind of Palestine. And that is the last thing the Israeli elites wanted. And so instead of having any kind of serious negotiations, they nurtured, and Omar says even financed through Qatar, that Netanyahu actually sent money to Hamas over the years. They wanted a kind of an extreme Islamic organization on the other side that, at least in their documents, say they wanted the extinction of Israel because it meant they didn't have to negotiate with anybody. And they thought every few years they could bomb the hell out of the place, not as badly as this, but they have that phrase, mowing the grass.
Yeah.
So often you bomb civilians in Gaza, and generally with an illegal siege, prohibit Gaza from any kind of normal economic development. I used to, you mentioned I had the show Counterspin.
Yes. Yeah.
So I once had a debate between Yuri Dan and Robert Fisk. Well, Fisk is well known as one of the, he's passed away recently, but he was one of the best of the independent journalists. In fact, he wrote for the British newspaper, The Independent, covering Middle East for years. And I arranged a debate between him and Yuri Dan. Yuri Dan was one of the closest advisors to Ariel Sharon, who people will remember was like a Netanyahu. And to get him to do the show, I'm on a phone conversation with Dan, and he's trying to suss out where I'm at on these things to see if he wants to do it. And I told him, my sister lived on a kibbutz for 10, 11 years. Her kids grew up in Israel, which is true. So he's thinking, oh, okay, this guy's with me. And then he says, well, what did you think of Israel? Because I told him I'd visited there. And I said, oh, it's a beautiful country. It's so beautiful. Of course, I was talking about the geography, not an apartheid system.
Right.
Anyway, he figured I was with him. So he started talking to me very openly. And he said, if it takes 1,000 years and 1,000 Jewish lives every year, someday from the river to the sea, all of this will be ours. That's the first time I ever heard that slogan, from the river to the sea, which makes it kind of ironic that it became a slogan for Palestinians. I hate the slogan, whichever side it comes from, but that's what they want. They want to diminish and eliminate a Palestinian presence as much as they can. It may not be a realistic plan, but I was at a film festival in Tel Aviv. I submitted my wrestling film.
Oh, okay. I'll tell the audience, watch it. It is very good.
Yeah, it's on the analysis website in the documentary section.
Okay.
And so I wasn't even going to go because, I don't know, I didn't feel right going to an Israeli film festival. But anyway, I asked, are there any Palestinians coming? And it turned out there were. There was like about 10 Palestinian filmmakers were coming to it. Okay. It's a small independent festival. So I figured, okay, if they're coming, I'll go. And I was told there, and this is back in like 98, I guess, that if it wasn't for the threat of Palestinian existence at the time, there wasn't much terrorism left, but there had been some. But if it wasn't for that, Israeli society would break out into civil war between the Orthodox versus the secular. That the secular population was absolutely fed up with the amount of power Orthodox rabbis had over normal everyday life, including how people get married and a whole range of things. They resented that Orthodox boys and girls didn't have to join the military. It was but as long as there's an external threat there, they're able to keep this down to some extent. So the agenda of the Israeli elites is the status quo or more, diminish And how would one think if you cause such suffering in Gaza, there won't be a response? So sometimes people ask me what I think of Hamas, and my answer usually is, I think the apartheid Israeli system is the underlying cancer. Hamas is a malignant tumor produced by that cancer. And you can't talk about the tumor if you don't talk about the cancer. And that's more or less what mainstream Western media and governments and so on, what happened on October 7th is a terrorist attack on civilians.
Mm-hmm.
What Hamas must have figured, the response would be devastating on the Palestinian population in Gaza, and apparently they didn't give a shit. Maybe, history didn't begin on October 7th, obviously.
Right.
But history didn't begin in 1948, because there is another side to this.
True.
Which is, several thousand years of the hatred of Jewish people. Mm-hmm. It weighs on the brains of many living Jews like a nightmare. So that can't be discounted either. And, the way the Likud and the far right in Israel, and for years, the elites, and for years, the persecution, suppression, of course, ending up in the genocide of Nazi attacks on Jews in World War II. You can't discount what that does to the mind of many Jews. Mm-hmm. And if I'd still been, in Ukraine, and, in theory, it wouldn't have been me, but whoever, probably, most of my Ukrainian family that was left, my Jewish Ukrainian family, didn't get out. Mm-hmm. They'd all be dead. And it doesn't weigh on my brain as much because I grew up in Toronto and I didn't experience that much anti-Semitism, but many people did. And so you can't discount how that affects people. But of course, it's no justification for the Israeli state and elites to do the same thing to the Palestinians as was done to the Jews. And they don't like that comparison because, how dare you compare, gas ovens. Well, okay, I agree. Gas ovens and the kind of slaughter of millions of Jews, it is a qualitatively worse phenomena. So it's not a direct comparison. But the dehumanization of Palestinians that is done in Israel, the extent of the racist feelings towards Palestinians. And when I was there last, about, 11, 12 years ago, I was just astounded how openly racist storekeepers and others were.
In Israel.
In Israel towards Palestinians, just
right.
Open.
Because they have Arabs are
Palestinians. The Israelis call them Arabs, but they're Palestinians.
Palestinians. There's some that are citizens of Israel, right?
Oh yeah, more than 1 million, I think.
That's right, and that's what they were worried about. I think
they're very second-class citizens too. They claim they're citizens, but
right,
all kinds of restrictions on Palestinian Israelis that don't exist on Jewish. Including the right of return. Any Jew in the world has the right to go immigrate back to Israel. It's not true for Palestinians.
Oh, isn't that true? And there's houses that were taken over by people from Israel that were actually Palestinians.
750,000 Palestinians were expelled in 48. But let's step back a bit here.
Okay.
You can't judge any of these situations without also looking at internationally, why is this geopolitics as it is? And you can't look at this without looking at how global monopoly capitalism works. Mm-hmm. And the fundamental thing about monopoly capitalism is the first word. Capitalism seeks monopoly. Whether it's, Pepsi versus Coke, if it's at the corporate level, you seek as much market share as you possibly can. And if you can possibly completely dominate a market, mm-hmm. You do. The way Google, to a large extent, dominates the online advertising. But but that happens at the nation state level too. It's an expression of the same, that nation states, to the extent they can, try to monopolize. Now, only the United States, and this is because of objective historical development, not because, the capitalists in the US are, somehow worse than others. They had the opportunity to become a global hegemon. Now, there is some specificity to the US, which makes it particularly violent. It's a country that was founded on the genocide of Native people, slave system, and then transitioning to a kind of foreign power, imperial power in the late 19th century. It fought a civil war. The issues were settled. Between rising monopoly capitalism, well, not monopoly at the time, industrial capitalism versus the slave system. Like, it's been a very, very violent society, which makes it somehow, I don't know, more acceptable for this society to commit crimes abroad. I mean, you can't, there's nothing comes close since World War II. You go through the wars and the hundreds of thousands and millions, really, of people that have been killed in wars instigated by the US in order to maintain a global dominance. And somehow that winds up, acceptable to most Americans. And even when it's not, it quickly fades into memory. I mean, the Iraq War, just an out and out blatant grab for oil and some advantage in the region, which both blew up in their face. They didn't get either advantage in the region. They didn't even wind up with control of the oil, but it made a lot of money for arms companies along the way, including Cheney's Halliburton. But he did. But that said, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has to be seen in the position that if the U.S. is going to be a global hegemon, it has to be a hegemon in every region. Or then you're just a region. Let's say your only power is in Latin America. Well, then you're a regional hegemon. But they want to be a global hegemon. So you got to, and they have been very successful more or less successful, dominating, although I must say not dominating as much as some of the left suggests. Like, they try to become the global hegemon. But they've lost every major war they've been in since World War II. I mean, what did they win? Grenada. Even Korean War, at best you could say it ended up as a stalemate. They didn't really get what they wanted. It's the overthrow of the North Korean government.
Well, we got some good movies out of that Grenada War too. So
yeah. So within the system, which is based on seeking monopoly. Each of these bigger powers that has the capability try to become as much dominant in their region, and then you get the odd one that has because of history, geography, has the possibility to be a global hegemon. And for them, that means Israel is one of the levers of power, or at least has been, in the Middle East.
It's financed quite a bit by the USA. I mean, billions of dollars, armaments.
It wouldn't
survive.
Unless they go make a deal with somebody else. I don't know.
They might have to get along with their neighbors then, if they didn't have the billions of dollars.
Well, yeah, but they call Israel a land-based aircraft carrier for the U.S. and it has atomic weapons, so it's there to threaten the rise of any kind of popular nationalist movements, which, like Nasser, Israeli, in fact, Israel did get involved in the Suez Crisis against Nasser.
Right.
Now, there's some debate in American foreign policy circles whether it's still advantageous or is it more of a liability, Israel. But as long as they can work out deals between the Israeli state and the Saudis and Emirates and those, that creates a fabric of alliances that are pro-US. But even there, they're not totally in control. That China started to develop good relations with the Saudis and brokered the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So the Americans strive for global hegemony, and in financial terms, they do. They've been quite successful using the CIA covertly. Their actual military footprint has been far less successful. But part of the logic of being a global hegemon to defend democracy around the world and liberal values, American values, which I'd love someone to explain to me what those values are, but justifies all the expense. And the power and lobbying power of the military industrial complex, the lobbying power of the nuclear weapons complex is profound. Because I'll say this quickly, but if you want, ask me another follow-up, I can go into it more. From the very beginning of US industrial capitalism and the very beginnings of the role of finance, financialization, which means the growth and importance and dominance of big banks, has evolved right alongside militarization. And it starts at the very least from the Civil War. The JP Morgan Bank grew out of selling, buying Union Army bonds, government bonds, and selling weapons to the Union Army, even though it was outright corrupt. You know, buy rifles for $2.25 and sell them for $22. I mean, even there, the war profiteering was terrible. But out of that grew the Morgan Bank. So it can this marriage between financialization and militarization being one of the most important pillars of the U.S. economy has not changed.
That's true. But I would also put in that Anglo-American, right? The British had quite the interest in the Mideast, especially British Petroleum with Mossadegh in Iran, right? So they had, again, it's the capitalists have their fingers in the pie and stirring it up.
Yeah, well, I mean, the British, if it's not, listen, you and I are both living in Canada.
Yay.
Canada could, they'd be the global hegemon. You know, if somehow through some historical, geographical opportunity, you know, a bigger population, and this isn't something particularly just unique about American elites. It's how, you know, how it developed. But all the capitalist elites would love to be the global hegemon, and the Canadians are very happy to ride on the U.S. gravy train. Even though, you know, a lot of times Canadians like to have some moral outrage about one thing or another, but it's skin deep because our arms industry is totally integrated with the American arms industry.
Well, it would be kinder and gentler power control.
No, we wouldn't.
Of the world. Yes.
No,
yes.
yeah. Because we treated Indigenous people in Canada so nicely.
We'd be polite about it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Now, we wouldn't even be polite. I don't even know where that came from. It's so nonsensical. Watch Canadian hockey players. They beat the shit out of each other all the time.
You got her. About it. You got her. Most Canadians have been jerseyed at one time or another. On there. So that is fascinating and a diatribe on its own. Iran news has been all the 100 Shahed drones flown into Israel. Israel's shot down, they say 99% of it. Do you think is there a connection because Hamas and Palestinians in Iran went to Russia for a meeting prior to the Hamas, I'm going to say massacre of civilians?
Yeah, that's what it was.
And now Iran, do you think there's a connection between these countries, between Russia, Iran, Palestine? I mean, like Palestine, who do they got? They got nobody in this world to get help from, right? Yeah, well, so they reach out, in China as well.
Well, it goes back to this thing I was saying before. The United States, to be global hegemon, has to be a hegemon in every region. So that means with the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953, who was a democratic, fairly somewhat progressive leader of Iran, was overthrown because he wanted to nationalize the oil industry, and the British didn't want it, neither did the Americans. And so they,
Right.
I mean, clearly well documented, went in and organized a coup. And,
yeah.
well, MI6 actually led it, but supported by the CIA.
Okay.
But they created a situation. Iran's a big, see, some countries are just suited for some power because they're big. So Iran's a big country, Canada's small. So Canada's not going to be a regional anything, but it can be of some use, you know, as I say, as a junior partner to the Americans. But Iran's big and has the population, resources with oil and gas and other things. You know, before all these sanctions, had a relatively advanced industrial sector. It has the wherewithal to be a power in the region. Well, if you want to be, if you can't incorporate Iran into the American system, then you got to suppress its growth. And so Iran has its own nationalist interests, which are essentially capitalist. I mean, you know, they have a theocracy, but they have a big capitalist oligarchy there, and many of the leading religious figures are themselves multimillionaires, maybe billionaires.
I get the impression that the theocracy in Iran isn't well liked by a majority of the people in Iran.
I mean,
just based on the women who.
I don't know if it's a majority. I think
okay.
There is widespread disenchantment,
yes.
and certainly amongst women, certainly amongst urban women. Apparently, in the recent movements, opposition movements, there was a lot more support in rural Iran. In the past, rural Iran has been more supportive of the government, of the theocrats. I have no idea what legitimate polling is, but one thing is for certain, I've been told by every Iranian I know, the more antagonistic the Americans are to Iran, the more sanctions there are, the more support the Iranian government gets, because people consider it humiliating and indignity. The way Iran gets talked about and treated in the West, it strengthens the theocracy. And the American leaders, planners, they know it. So maybe they don't mind having this Iranian threat out there.
Right.
You know, it serves a lot of purposes. It serves a lot of purposes for Israel to have an Iranian threat. You know, it justifies having essentially now an authoritarian government, a completely militarized economy. An antagonistic Iran is very useful. And the same thing goes for Russia. Why, after the fall of the Soviet Union, why wasn't Russia incorporated into Western Europe?
Yes, I agree.
They wanted to be.
Yep. Putin wanted to join NATO at one time.
There was talks about it. Yeltsin certainly wanted to. Yeah. They wanted to normalize. There was even talk about some kind of membership of the EU. So why didn't that happen? And the answer, I think, is clear. For the same issues with Iran, Russia is a big country. It has a big population. It has nuclear weapons. It has had a relatively advanced industry. It has the potential for real regional power. Do you want that in Western Europe? What about I'm talking now, we meaning, you know, from an American point of view. I'll be damned if I'll take responsibility for the American. I'm saying it that way. Imagine if Russia was incorporated as part of the EU, even in NATO, but forget NATO for now. Imagine if there'd been a Russian-German alliance. Imagine that economy. I mean, the EU is already almost the same size as the American economy. If you put it all together, the population certainly is the same size. Right. But imagine you add Russia to that. What do they need the US for? You know, the whole rationale for NATO, with being a US-dominated NATO, is the Russian threat. Otherwise, what's the point? So if you incorporate Russia into Europe in a normal, legitimate, you know, capitalist way, what the hell do they need the US for? So it was really in the American interest not to allow things to get normalized with Russia. And by restricting a natural development, a natural capitalist development of Russia, they sowed the seeds for what has become a totally toxic religious nationalist ideology that is very dangerous. Yeah. But they did the same. Now, I don't want to compare in any direct way Putin to Hitler, because he's done nothing like that. And the Americans, if anyone you want to compare to something that comes close to German crimes, you're going to have to point to the US before you could ever point to Putin. But that said, it is a toxic, nationalist, aggressive state. What they've done in Ukraine is illegal. But this all, even though the U.S. helped create this situation. Now, well, what I was going to say is they also helped to create Hitler. They thought Hitler was going to just attack the Soviet Union, and FDR did nothing until the very end to stop American corporations from sending vehicles and other kinds of industrial output to Hitler. In fact, I've heard it said by historians that Hitler could never have invaded, even in the beginning, without American vehicles. Henry Ford was a big supporter of Hitler. I mean, this is fairly well known. He used to send Hitler money every year on his birthday and was given a big award by the Nazis. In fact, Hitler said he learned about how to message anti-Semitism from the newspaper that Ford used to put out in Detroit.
Yeah, actually, I think it also was the eugenics with Lindbergh and stuff. He was impressed with that, and that's where he got.
So all of these things have to be looked at. That it's not just the U.S. as the evil bad guy. It's a global system within which every country strives. All of these big capitalist countries strive for the interests of their own elites. It's a class question, but some are in better position than others. So now the elites in Western Europe, they've been groomed. The ones that were willing to survive under the U.S. umbrella have been groomed to power as part of the U.S. system.
Right.
And by keeping Russia out of it, a nuclear power, it means the Western European countries are dependent on an American nuclear umbrella. And somehow in their, the whole thing is completely insane, because as if this nuclear umbrella is going to save you. I mean, it's not, if something starts, say goodbye to Europe in no time. So what does it mean we need to do? I mean, we need to educate people and talk about this as a class question. Like take Ukraine, for example. I think the people of Ukraine, and when I say people, I mean the whole of the people, including the elites, but including workers and ordinary people, they have a right to resist an illegal invasion. But should they? And should they the way it's happening? And what I mean by that is, when it became clear, and it became clear very early on, that the Russians were going to be able, at the very least, to control Donbass and Crimea, at the least that. Why keep fighting on the Ukrainian side? Why tens and hundreds of thousands of lives lost? So that the Ukrainian elites can regain control of Donbass and maybe Crimea, although that was unlikely. Like, why all these workers dying so that this utterly corrupt Ukrainian oligarchy can regain control? Like, why do that? Now I understand the nationalist urge, and they do, in terms of legality, had a right to resist that Russian invasion. But why hundreds of thousands of lives to fight to some stalemate, which everyone was predicting early on? Why not acknowledge, well, actually what should have been done before there was ever an invasion, why not take NATO off the table? Why not put it on the table?
Why
What do you mean?
not
No, I mean,
have
I mean,
NATO troops in Ukraine to deter Russia at the time?
oh God, then you're asking for fucking World War. No,
I think we got a world war as it is, but
no, we don't. No, no, no.
I understand what you're saying. So,
No,
but
Ukraine, no, one of the main justifications for the invasion was that Ukraine was going to wind up in NATO. And the truth of it was they weren't.
yeah, that's
Germany
true.
and France were against it.
Yes.
Turkey was in all likely. They were not going to get consensus.
Mhm.
And there were lots of voices in Ukraine saying to the Ukrainian state, to Zelensky, just say Ukraine won't join NATO. Get it off the table. Take away the excuse.
Mhm.
They could have, without changing anything, because Ukraine wasn't getting into NATO anyway. I mean, it was a BS excuse that Putin used,
Mhm. That
but
I
he did.
agree with. Yeah.
And they could have stopped. They could have just taken away that excuse, and it would have diffused any, whatever popular support there is in Russia for the invasion.
Mhm.
How do you justify it to the Russian people if you can say, okay, NATO, Ukraine won't be part of NATO?
Do you think the Russian people have a say in their government? I
Do we?
mean, Putin won
Do
by
we?
no.
Oh,
Does the Russian people, because Putin won by 80%, right? So doesn't that show that Russia wants the war to continue? If they give,
no,
I know it doesn't, but
no. I mean,
you see what I mean?
the people have less to say than Canadians, but Canadians have next to nothing to say either.
Oh yeah,
But
that's true.
that said, yeah, of course, the elections are phony as hell in
Right,
Russia.
right,
There's a veneer of elections here, and they're not completely phony, but it's mostly veneer.
right.
But the elections in Russia are totally a crock. But the nationalist religious narrative is very powerful in Russia. But why does it have power? It goes back to what I said. They didn't allow a normal, natural development of Russia within Europe.
Yes, yes, I agree with you. They didn't get the controls in place or anything as a
Well,
democracy.
it's like the Versailles Treaty, leads to the rise of fascism in Germany after World War One. You have such a horrible, onerous treaty on Germany that humiliated everybody.
Right.
It created a fertile soil for extreme nationalism.
I'd also
Things happen now.
I'd also say the response from the world is like when Russia came into Crimea and there was no response. It's kind of like when Hitler went into the Rhineland. What was it, 33 or 36? 33, I think. And he thought the French and everybody would gang up. He only had 20,000 soldiers there, yet the world did nothing.
Yeah, but I don't think it's the same.
No?
No, I think there's very good evidence. First of all, the fact that Crimea was even in Ukraine was a weird anomaly of Khrushchev
I know.
giving
I hear you.
Crimea back to Ukraine during the Soviet Union.
I actually think Crimea was on the table and that Zelensky would have let it go. Just from what I've been reading, that was my
Yeah,
supposition.
but I'm saying at the time
Right,
that Russian in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea,
right,
it was a unique situation, and not only was Crimea weirdly in the Ukraine because Stalin, or I think it was actually Khrushchev that gave
yeah, Khrushchev
Stalin, I
did.
can't remember, it's Khrushchev.
Yeah,
But there was after the referendum, which I'm sure was done not in very open conditions, but 3 Western polling firms went to Crimea after the referendum.
hmm
And they came up with polling results that were the same as the referendum. The majority of people in Crimea wanted to be in Russia. And that is the real secret of how this thing should have been solved and maybe still can. There should have been legitimate referendums. Do you want to be in Ukraine? You want to be independent? You want to be in Russia?
right.
And the Ukrainian government pre-invasion should have organized those things. But as I say, the Ukrainian oligarch was completely corrupt. They
Right.
were nothing democratic about them.
But there's a thing to be said for the Russians taking the Tartars and Ukrainians out of Crimea prior to the vote,
Yeah.
apparently in the
Well,
gulags,
I don't know about so much prior, but over decades they had done
yeah,
so.
well, millions.
But
So
yeah, the Tartars were not for it, but the majority of people in Crimea were. Listen, none of this is going to be pretty or nice or really democratic.
you got that right.
But I don't think Crimea was a place for the quote unquote West who doesn't give a shit about democracy except to pay lip service when it serves them. That wasn't a place to start a war with Russia.
Okay, good.
And Ukraine had lots of opportunities to solve the Donbass problem without
which was,
without the
I mean,
invasion.
it was a problem created by Russia, though, you know, sending their
Uh,
little green men into Luhansk and into the Donetsk and taking over
yeah,
the
but
government buildings.
why did that happen?
Well,
It
that's
happened. No, it happened because in 2014, this right-wing government comes to power in Kyiv and starts treating the speaking people in Donbass like shit.
okay.
Then what happens is you actually have a very progressive coming out of the unions and other words. Workers start to take power in Donbass, not the elites. And you know, Boris Kargalitsky, who's now sitting in jail for 5 years for opposing the war in Russia, he actually started comparing it to the Paris Commune, where, you know, where the workers took over Paris. So in
I've
the beginning,
never heard it this way before, Paul. So
well,
I'm fascinated.
in the beginning, the independence movement in Donbass wasn't even an independence movement. In the beginning, in 2014, for
Mhm.
2, 3 years, the demand was for a federated state,
True.
something like Quebec is within Canada.
Yes. Yeah. Actually,
Autonomy,
that's right.
have control of their own language laws,
Right.
and the Ukrainian oligarchy turned it down. And they didn't like the far right policies that came to power in 2014, which included being very anti-union, very corrupt
Right.
oligarchy. So in the beginning, the resistance from Donbass was quite legitimate, I think. And but over the years, as the Ukrainian government started between 2014 and 2018, tried to take back Donbass militarily. And the people of Donbass didn't want it and fought. And then that's when Putin starts taking advantage of this.
Well,
And the little green men start going in.
you had Gherkin go in there and take over government buildings. Are we sure the people didn't want it? Is how are we basing that?
Well, the people, it's never homogenous, but my understanding is the majority of Donbass did not want the rule of the Ukrainian oligarchs, but they didn't want to be part of Russia then either.
That's great. Yeah.
They wanted to be federated within Ukraine.
Hmm.
Then when it started to die down, like in 2018, this is part of the lies of Putin and some of the Putin supporters. The actual war almost virtually ended in 2018. Like, you know, one of the supposed excuses for the Russian invasion was they thought there was going to be a genocide against Donbass coming from the Ukrainian government. It's just bullshit. There's no evidence of it. From 2018 to right up until just before the invasion,
Hmm.
the fighting had completely died down. From 20, if I remember my numbers correctly, based on the OSCC, the Organization for Security in Europe, they had security monitors on the partition line, and they were monitoring the fighting. And you can find these reports online. The number of people that were killed between 2018 and the end of 2021, total non-army deaths, like civilian deaths, was about 320.
Okay.
More people were killed in car accidents. And the military deaths were not much either. They were kind of shelling back and forth, and not much was happening. There was no imminent genocide, total BS. The problem, we have to look at this from a class point of view.
Okay.
The Ukrainian oligarchy are not the good guys. The Russian oligarchy are certainly not the good guys. Both oligarchies didn't give a shit what happened to their own people, to their own workers. You know, the Russians are more, you know, Putin couldn't give damn that hundreds of thousands of Russian workers are now, you know, were slaughtered in the Ukraine. But the same thing's going on now. Like, what is the point of continuing this war from the Ukrainian point of view? You know, why not get a ceasefire, freeze the lines where they are? There's nothing stopping a continuation of a resistance against Russian occupation if that's what the people want, you can have general strikes.
Right.
You could even, I suppose, have a certain level of military resistance, but a popular resistance would probably be more effective, meaning like strikes. In fact, I think that would have been more effective on day one. The Russian tanks are coming in. Instead of immediately going to an armed resistance, what about a couple of 100,000 people sit in the highway in front of the tanks? How would that have looked like to the Russian people who would have seen this? In the very beginning, most Russians I talked to said, "Oh, we'll never invade. The Ukrainians are our brothers," and all of this.
Right.
That would have been reinforced by I'm not a total pacifist, but there's no point to that kind of armed resistance if it is going to turn into a shit show.
Well, it turned into a shit show. Is what it did, and I appreciate what you're saying about the Ukrainian oligarchs being corrupt, but the Crimea and the Donbass, they just changed oligarchs, is what then they got the Russian oligarchs in there.
Yeah, no, they do. So let them fight it.
Now,
what there should be,
yeah,
and it's maybe too late for this, there should be a UN supervised referendum in Donbass and Crimea, and say, what do you want to do? And that would be a democratic solution.
Well, that's kind of where I wanted to take the conversation, was the lack of power that the UN has now in this world compared to when Pearson and them were doing it. It should have been a ceasefire, but for as good as the UN has done with the Palestine-Israel conflict, I mean, would it have mattered? So now with Zelensky,
early on,
right?
If NATO had clearly said Ukraine is not joining NATO,
right,
and in exchange for that had said now there should be referendums and let people decide, maybe it was a shot.
Yeah, something like that. I think a last minute shot. Actually, if I remember right, Zelensky was in a panic trying to tell the Russians that too, wasn't he? From what I read. And as far as that goes, though, I don't believe the NATO that Ukraine was going to go to NATO, so Russia had to invade. I really don't.
I don't either, but it was a good excuse to invade, and they
had a whole bunch of excuses.
Away.
Yeah, we got to get rid of the Nazis there, the Jewish president who's a Nazi, and
yeah, I know. I mean, it's all stupid. The only one I think that really resonated with the Russian people is the NATO thing.
Right.
I mean, yeah, if you want to get rid of if you want to denazify Russia first, and then talk about it.
Isn't that true? Do you think Zelensky's done a good job in trying to get the corruption under control as a government?
I don't know. I don't know. I have no idea. I really don't know. I suspect not, but I don't know.
Right. Because he has to, in order to join the EU, and he's hell-bent on joining the EU, pushing his country towards that, which can't be probably joined till the resolution of this war. So if we were to freeze the lines where they are right now, and maybe have a plebiscite or a UN neutral zone, I don't know if it can be accomplished, but without the reinforcements of the American weapons going into Ukraine, the Ukrainians might have to drift towards this idea of just freezing the conflict. Now, if the conflict is frozen, do you expect it'll be frozen? Do you expect Russia will climb in and have more? Do you think that's the extent?
I think they got what they want. What is the point of trying to occupy Western Ukraine? It would never end.
Right.
Be a war for Russia forever. And, whether they dream about such things, what would be the point?
Well, and in that regard too,
assuming there's rationality there.
Right. And look what Russia's accomplished. They've got Poland fully armed to the teeth. The Baltic nations, you've got Sweden in NATO and in Finland, and he's really ruined his sphere of influence by doing what he's doing. Now, he's not a young man, but it seems that everybody waits for the dictator to die, and then things will be better. I'm thinking of Chile and and all that. Once Pinochet goes away, it'll be okay. I don't think that rationale ever works. We
It
don't.
depends. I don't think you can generalize.
Well,
Sometimes it might, and other times it won't. Right now, the problem is in Russia, it's every bit as it's more likely you might get someone more to the right, more militaristic than even Putin. That's a very good possibility. It's unless this thing, it depends what happens in a year or two. The economy's become very militarized.
right.
So it's created a lot of stimulus. There's economic growth. They're throwing money around like crazy. They're paying off families whose kids die in the war.
Well, he bankrolled this by keeping gold and stuff in stock and having a Russian rainy day fund.
Yeah,
So they had
but is it
plans for that.
sustainable?
Yeah.
But is it sustainable? So like
No,
a
it
year or
isn't.
2 years from now,
No, with the Ukrainians bombing the refineries and the oil production and stuff, I think it was last guest we had close to 20% of capacity is reduced now. And that's money in Russia's pocket that they use to finance the war. Now, once that goes away, I mean, there's going to
I
be
wouldn't bet on that at all unless
no.
some drastic change. No, no. Right now, in the relatively short term, as far as I mean, what do I know? I'm reading stuff like everybody else.
Yeah.
As far as I can tell from what I'm reading, the Russian economy has been far more resilient. The sanctions aren't bothering it. As long as India and China keep buying and others are buying Russian stuff and fuel and all the rest.
And Western companies are also selling to Russia still.
Yeah.
You know, like, come on.
So generally speaking, as I understand it, economies that are very dependent on militarization, eventually that blows up. It's a kind of Keynesianism that can't be sustained. And two, it's all fueled by the selling of fossil fuels. They're not just a gas station. They have fertilizers and industrial products and arms they sell. There's other parts to the economy. But all parts of the economy are fueled by the fuel, R&D and development. And it's very profound, as I've been told by Russians,
Yeah.
the effect of the fossil fuel. So what happens when one of a few things goes? One is if the price goes down significantly. What happens if countries do start to get serious about phasing out fossil fuel because of climate? What happens if the Russian economy, just gets so one-sided because of the militarization? So if you start to have deep economic crisis in Russia, that might change the scenario of who comes to power. But the way things are now, I don't see whoever's coming to power is going to be a pro-Western, supposed liberal Democrat. Not that there ever really was one there. Navalny wasn't that anyway. He was just pro-Western.
Yeah.
He was just pro-Western.
Yeah, he was a nationalist.
I mean, if the West wants to mitigate what could be coming, which is an even more dangerous situation in Russia, is make a deal in Ukraine, normalize things as much as possible, and not feed this toxic nationalist religious fervor in Russia. But of course, it serves the military-industrial complex and others for Russia to be like that. So they don't want to do it.
Well, if that's the case, how come the bill that's stuck in the Congress isn't put through? Because I would assume a lot of the Republicans take military money, or in their states they have plants. Why is it just stagnating? The $60 billion for Ukraine. And interestingly enough, I was talking about Poland being armed. Europe has now surpassed the United States in sending money to the Ukraine for these weapons.
Well, it's a kind of small rump in the Republican Party that's blocking this.
Boy, aren't they?
But it's part of the Trumpian outlook, which is the main enemy is China.
Mm-hmm.
They don't think the United States should be fighting on two fronts.
Okay.
They want the United States to focus on China. And so making a deal with Russia, mitigating the war in Ukraine, putting the resources more into the it's not like they want less military spending. I mean, there's a very odd one, maybe a Rand Paul, maybe. But the majority of them aren't advocating less military spending. They just want it all focused on China.
We had 1.2 million immigrants come into Canada last year. I'm going to put forward that we're having growing pains. I know my own doctor is quitting his practice to look after his parents, and which is admirable. But that means I have to now look for a GP, and I think many Canadians, especially on the East Coast, are having this problem with doctors. The immigrants coming in. I think there's going to be a clash between people who are here and the immigrants coming here because of our ability not to have the infrastructure to house them, or for rents for the young people. I remember in the 70s when the Vietnamese came in, they assimilated into the country, keeping their own values. The Sikhs in the 80s, quite a bit, but this time around, I mean. It's a touchy subject, immigration. However, I think we have quite the growing pains, and I'm seeing a lot of, even amongst my own friends, some comments and stuff. And do you have any thoughts on how we should deal with this?
Yeah, and everyone knows the solutions.
What's the solution, Paul?
Well, number one, fast track immigrants who already have medical degrees and vet them way faster, and create clinics all over the place that are easy for people to get to. I mean, how many skilled doctors are driving taxi cabs or whatever? Bicycling food all over the damn place.
Yeah, a lot of Uber doctors.
Number two, they should.
Dr. Ubers? Just before you go into number two, based on that, so we have a system in place where only so many Canadian citizens can have spots at the university for doctors.
Yeah, but why don't increase? Do you know how many doctors they had in Cuba? Cuba's medical system and the training doctors was every bit as good as Canadian.
They have great doctors.
They had thousands of doctors. They were, the amount of training that was happening there.
We're not necessarily getting the Cubans into the country though, right?
Well,
now. And
I'm not saying that's the solution. The solution is to train way more doctors, and there's the Canadian Medical Association for some reason doesn't want to do it.
There you go. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of forces at the provincial levels and maybe federal, depending who's in power, who really want to privatize stuff.
Right.
So the more screwed up and underfunded the medical system is, they think the stronger will be the demand for private medical care. Even though people outside Canada don't know that Canadian GPs are private. It's not like, in some countries where everybody's part of the public system, Canadian doctors are actually individual owners of their own medical practice, unless they work at hospitals.
Right.
But they don't, they don't want to tax wealthy people enough to fund the system well enough. I mean, it's straightforward. We didn't used to have this problem, and it wasn't because there wasn't immigration. There used to be enough money in the system, and now we have OR rooms empty because they don't have enough nurses to staff the ORs. I mean, it's insane.
I've seen wings of hospitals empty because they didn't have enough staff and didn't want to. That the foreign students, though, for universities and stuff, they pay so much more money that they're a cash grab for the universities.
Yeah.
Right. Versus citizens who are here trying to become a doctor.
Yeah, I know. Tell me why countries like, I believe Norway is one of them.
Right.
They not only have free university for their own citizens, they have free university for anybody that applies to go there. I mean, Germany
and Denmark, same thing as well. That's the way it should be. We have infrastructure problems here. We took in a lot of people, Now, Trudeau's getting blamed for this, of course. Well, he's the government. Looks like I don't think the other parties have a solution that I've heard either.
Well, the Conservatives have a solution.
Uh,
Fuel anti-immigrant sentiment and exacerbate the contradictions as much as possible and use it to get elected the way Trump is.
well, the stuff that Pierre is saying, it doesn't sound like he's for that. He's for having temporary foreign workers for the corporations that need them.
Yeah,
So
but the solution obviously is not less immigration, which a lot of conservatives are promoting. In fact, we need more people now. We have a demographic vacuum here. Canada's depopulating.
right.
But there needs to be a methodology to it that supports the social safety net, and it requires, real taxation of the wealthy. The main thing people have to understand about Canada, is our audience mostly Canadian or American here?
American and Mexican and Europe. So
Anyway, people have to understand that the real power in Canada is in a handful of big banks. And the banking power here is even more monopolized and centralized than in the United States. Even though there it's big, but here we have 4 or 5 banks, and they dominate the economy and actually really dominate the politics. But they're very good at keeping their profile down.
yeah.
But they're there, to defend Canadian corporate interests, elite interests, and means the same thing about lower taxes. And if the way to get lower taxes and strengthen the banking corporate hand here is to force attention on immigration and blame immigrants, it's an old game.
Yes, it is. It's an old game, but we also have consolidation. The powers that be let people consolidate. What happened to the Competition Act, right? We have Loblaws. They own all the suppliers. They might own a lot of the farmers as well. And then they're saying their prices are raised because of the suppliers, yet they own the middle part, the stockades and the suppliers. So they're making a profit on both ends, the supply plus selling to the public.
Well, there's something that could be done in the U.S. and in Canada. Why don't they use the idea of like a war profiteering tax?
Sure.
And just find out what were the profits pre-pandemic,
Right.
and tax post-pandemic profits, which seem to be higher. Certainly the prices are higher, and tax them at like 93, 95%. Like, make it not worthwhile.
You're going back to the Eisenhower tax rate is what you're doing, right? Which was phenomenally successful, and plus they had free education.
Or another solution I even like buy Metro or something, which is the other grocery chain. Just create a publicly owned grocery chain.
Well, that's what a co-op's supposed to be, right?
Yeah, or take some of the co-op system and make it
Right. And
up scale.
IGA, the Independent Grocers Association, is now Sobeys for the main part.
Yeah, I mean, if you had a publicly owned grocery chain,
right,
you took out excessive profit and just made enough profit to keep the thing to invest and modernize and such and pay better wages, you could force the price of food down. You could do that. It doesn't have to be just in food.
Paul, are you like Tucker Carlson, where you buy your own groceries?
I'm not sure Tucker Carlson and I are in the same species, so I don't like.
Okay.
Yeah, I along with my wife, I buy groceries. Yeah,
all right. So the quality of groceries that are in the stores right now, we should be having last year's apples, and I'm sure they're from 2 years ago, and California lettuce in the summertime in Alberta shouldn't be a thing. We should have local farmers supplying to the grocery stores, and that'll keep the carbon footprint down. The quality of the groceries, especially vegetables, I find is really drastically reduced.
Unless you go to an upper end store and pay tons more.
Well, I think all our grocery stores are now upper end, or at least they tell themselves that, right? It's really ridiculous, especially
Listen, the bottom line here is that
so in poor areas, they'll raise the price of groceries, like Safeway will, because these people don't necessarily have the means of transportation to go elsewhere to Costco's and bulk stores, which is just
yeah. Let's just cut to the chase here.
cut to the chase, Paul.
Solution is
Yes.
public ownership and democratization. We have lots of good models in Canada of publicly owned things that really work. Like in Ontario, we have the LCBO. In BC, I think you've got a pretty successful auto insurance plan.
Yep.
Publicly owned stuff can work. It can keep prices down. And there's no reason why we shouldn't extend the concept of public ownership into many sectors of the economy. Although I'll tell you the most important one, create a publicly owned bank that can compete with the big banks and start to use capital to invest in productive stuff, not speculation, reduce fees, stop going on stupid acquisitions in the United States, if we're talking Canada.
Well, yes. CN Rails, I think they bought Burlington and, But
we don't talk about this very much. Like even the NDP, when's the last time you heard them talk about public ownership?
I don't even know if they're for workers anymore, to be honest. I don't. But what you just said there was the tenet of politics in Canada and the United States in the 50s was to have public ownership to keep prices down from private.
Well, in Canada, I don't know about the U.S. In Canada,
yeah, yes, no. From what I was reading, anyways. But yeah, no, we don't talk about this in Canada anymore, and it's sad because we should be a co-op country, as far as I'm concerned, right? My mind drifted. I had a question for you.
We'll take some questions.
Okay. Anybody have any questions in the audience there, guys?
So first, thanks. Appreciate your time. Appreciate talking to us. The thought I have had, and I guess I'm curious if you think it's accurate. Just so Israel bombed the Iranian consulate, they killed Zayedi, and so Iran, retaliated. Now it seems like Israel is going to say, well, we have to respond to that response, and the United States isn't going to do anything, or will they? It feels like this wouldn't have happened if they weren't already in the middle of a genocide in Gaza, and just sort of this feels like part of a bigger plan that includes Palestine, but also obviously have been wanting to do this with Iran for a long time.
Are you asking what the response from Israel is after the bombing by Iran, Jake?
Sort of, yeah. Well, I'm wondering if you think they would have even bombed the consulate.
No, I think what you're saying is right. They did it as a Israel has never been so isolated as it was prior to the Iranian attack on Israel. And the heat was coming down domestically on Netanyahu, the demonstrations against Netanyahu in the streets. The attack on the Iranian consulate was so obviously a distraction and an attempt to provoke the Iranians into doing something that would take the heat off Netanyahu, which is why I don't know why the hell they played along. Because it seems like the Iranians, essentially took the bait and didn't have to.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. But also, and then we're saying U.S. isn't going to get involved, but I feel honestly they bombed the consulate because they know we're not going to do shit about it. But also if it does escalate more, will the U.S. back them up? It feels like they just can't go to Israel.
I don't know the answer. I know that the Biden administration doesn't want a war with Iran. And Biden apparently told Netanyahu in a phone call yesterday or the day before not to retaliate, and that and Kirby, the I think that's his name, the White House spokesman, was on all the American shows Sunday morning, saying that Biden told the Israelis that if they attack Iran, the United States will not be part of it. So they've said that very publicly. I believe that's the case. The U.S. does not want part of an Iranian war. On the other hand, I wouldn't put it past Netanyahu to create some false flag kind of thing, where the Israelis blow some shit up in Israel and blame it on the Iranians, or they want some attack on Iran that kills some people in Tehran, which means now the Iranians have to, it's possible this spirals out of control in a way the U.S. can't not get involved. I would say that's probably what Netanyahu would like to happen. But I'm not expecting it now. I just think it feels like the balance of forces are such that it would be Netanyahu would be sticking his neck out a little bit too far. But, if he feels his own personal life / careers on the line and might be on his way to jail, who knows what he's capable of.
Why do the Israelis keep voting for Netanyahu?
Well,
is it like us? They have nobody to vote for?
The short answer is Israeli public opinion has been very fascized over the decades, partly because of terrorist attacks from the Palestinians. So mind you, for decades, there hasn't been anything serious before this October 7th thing. But they've created a culture of fear, and that creates the right kind of support for this kind of authoritarian leader. And Israeli population, the vote is so fractured, so that the Orthodox Jews have an outweighted power electorally because they have their population is growing, and Netanyahu promised them everything they wanted in terms of religious rights and such, power in the cabinet that they never had before. And certainly it didn't take very long after he became prime minister again this time that I think most Israelis were very disillusioned and wanted them gone. And October 7th very conveniently shows up.
Right.
And I still find it hard to believe.
Yeah, it's
Israelis that are supposed to have such a fantastic intelligence service didn't know something was coming.
Yeah. No, good point. It's amazing how through the 60s and 70s, Israel was looked at as a socialist utopia. In the kibbutz, kids were going down there, and now how it's changed to quite fascist in its way. Rodrigo, you had a question, my friend?
Just to point out that Iran apparently notified Israel and the United States in advance. They told them where the drones would be coming from, and they still had to spend like $1 billion trying to bring down those drones, which is very unsustainable because the drones cost less than $5 million apparently.
Oh, the drones are can be as less as under 10,000.
Yeah, well, if I'm Lockheed Martin and Northrop, I'm not crying the blues today.
That's true.
Also,
that $1 billion of weaponry, of Patriots and whatever, all has to be replaced.
It's an interesting spectacle, but also worrying that Iran has to be the voice of reason and say, we're trying to straddle the line between we won't let you walk all over us murdering our people, our important people, but also we don't want to start World War III. And Netanyahu seems to be willing to maybe start World War III rather than stop his policies, which is very worrisome.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the Iranians have been so reasonable here. If the Iranians actually cared about Gaza, they would not have done this. They took all the attention off the genocide, and now it's all about Iran's attack on Israel, and everybody's coming, oh, we're with Israel again. You know, they took Israel, as I said, in its most isolated moment. And now all these Western governments, who are, a lot of them getting very critical of the genocide, all of a sudden now there's solidarity with Israel again. The timing was terrible. And I don't give a damn about $1 billion of this and only a few million of that. This did not help the people of Gaza one bit.
To be fair to Iran, when Trump was president, he ordered their second top general murdered, and
Yeah.
they couldn't retaliate in proportion. They had to launch an attack on some soldiers
Yeah.
and call it a day.
Well, not even on some
Have a lot of leeway.
They deliberately didn't do it in a way that didn't kill anybody. But yeah, well, there's a balance of power difference here. And, you know, Trump killed Soleimani as a provocation, as a distraction from his impeachment hearings. General McKenzie was the head of CENTCOM at the time, wanted to use it to start a war with Iran. Yeah, the Americans are, you know, are the primary criminals in most of this. But that said, you know, I'm not saying Iran didn't have a right to respond. Like I said earlier, you know, about Ukraine, they had a right, but they shouldn't have. Not this way. Not at a time when there's a famine in Gaza, and now all we're talking about is the Iranian attack. Why aren't we talking about the famine in Gaza?
Does that answer your question, Rod? Do you have?
Zelensky was told to stop attacking Russian oil fields because the US doesn't want them destabilizing the oil price. Can you talk about that?
Well, it sounds reasonable. I can believe it. I don't know anything about it. But I also think they don't want Ukraine attacking anything on Russian soil, really, because there's a point where Russia is going to get provoked to do much more than they're doing right now. You know, they're not. You know, they're not. They could. I assume they have the power to, you know, destroy a lot of Kyiv if they wanted to, and then some. And so, you know, the Americans don't want this to go beyond where it is. You know, I think everybody kind of wants a stalemate right now. The Americans want a stalemate. If they don't send these extra weapons to Ukraine, they may not have a stalemate. But then the answer is, okay, start negotiating now. Don't wait.
There is a politician, you may have heard of, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who just this weekend threatened again to take the Speaker of the House out again for agreeing to hold a vote to send weapons to Ukraine. And no one is asking if she's working for Putin. No one is.
Oh, yeah, some people are asking. But I don't think that's what it is. I doubt it. I think it's more the Trumpian electoral view is you don't give Biden any wins. And if they won and sent the money to Ukraine and the Ukrainians were able to have some advantage and look like they're doing better, it looks like a win for Biden. I think that's one aspect. The other is, like I said earlier, the real Trumpian strategy is China. They want almost or even war with China. The guy Colby, who's likely to be, if Trump were to win, might be his Secretary of Defense, that you can't get more hawkish than these guys. And Steve Bannon's been about this right from the beginning, you know, for years. The enemy is China, and it used to be radical Islam, but now it's China. So to come to some compromise with Russia is part of the strategy of attacking China. In fact, if they had their way, they would like to split Russia from China and allow Russia to have a little bit more normalization with the West and isolate China. But for them, everything's about China. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, although she's a nutcase, I think she's part of this anti-China Trumpian strategy.
Well, that's fascinating, right? Never thought about it that way too. Ukraine angle, I'm going to give that some thought because that did not. So I'm of the view that if they would have got the weapons to begin with, they probably would have pushed the Russians out by now, and this would have been over. However, that could be wrong as well.
Even if you're right,
You know,
how many tens and hundreds of thousands of people would have died in the course of it? And so what? So that, like I said, so the Ukrainian oligarchs can control the area. I mean,
that's right.
I'm against this kind of warfare and where hundreds of thousands of people die to make one section of oligarchs rich or the other.
Yeah, that's I agree with you on that. But it's the way mankind's been for years, right?
Well, let's stop
It's
it.
unfortunate. Yeah, let's stop it. Let's put up co-ops in Ukraine and Russia. So there.
And I can ask one last thing.
Are you from Mexico, Rod?
Yes, I am.
Okay, go ahead.
Robert Reich has been talking about greedflation in his YouTube channel, and he seems to be carefully straddling the line between yes, corporations are greedy and they're raising prices more than they actually have to, but also Biden is good and we can rock the boat too much, so we can't go too deep into the explanations. Do you think his position is correct, or at some point does he have to start criticizing Biden too?
I didn't quite understand it because of the sound quality. Did you get it?
What was the name of the YouTube tuber you were talking about, Rodrigo?
Robert Reich.
Oh yeah, Robert Reich.
Robert Reich.
Of
Okay.
Labor, I think.
You're saying he's not criticizing Biden, and there might be a day where he has to? Is that what you're kind of saying?
Yes, he's been talking about greedflation, but making it clear that it's not Biden's fault where he's concerned.
Well, it's the inflation's not Biden's fault. I mean, the spending the Biden administration has done so far kept the United States out of a big recession. Everyone was expecting one. And the reasons for inflation, if you look at higher wages, which wages did go up a little bit, or government spending, my understanding it's less than 5, maybe 10% of inflation. The vast majority of the inflation was caused by the pandemic, supply chain issues, semiconductor issues, the cost of oil, and which is very triggered to geopolitical crises. The vast majority of inflation had nothing to do with government spending, and still doesn't. And the high interest rates are not meant to dampen the real causes of inflation, because high interest rates don't do anything to deal with supply chain issues or deal with the price of energy. So why do they have high interest rates? Primarily because they do want to dampen a certain amount of economic activity to stop wages from going up, and they want more unemployment. They keep bragging how unemployment's coming down, but the more unemployment goes down, the more wages go up. So the Fed doesn't want too heated an economy, because the big thing that came out of the pandemic, and this is very important, because of the supply chain disruption, all of a sudden American workers gained some leverage, because it's not so easy to say we're shipping your jobs to Asia now when you don't trust the supply chain. And whether you want to ship them to China, you want to ship it to India, but what about the next time a big pandemic hits, which everyone's expecting the next time? Or because of climate crisis, you start having supply chain. If you can't trust stuff getting here, you start giving leverage to American workers. So, and we were seeing it because unionization rates were going up, strikes were going up. There was a new sense of confidence amongst American workers, and it had a lot to do with the leverage coming out of the pandemic. So these relatively higher interest rates, they're there to dampen that wages might continue to go up. And you know, and then people asked, there's an interesting thing the other day on 60 Minutes. The guy asked Powell from the Fed, how come inflation's coming down, but the prices of housing and food aren't?
Mm-hmm.
And Powell laughed, chuckled, I should say. And he says, well, prices, once they reach a level, they don't come down unless there's a deep recession. They never come down. Well, but the guy didn't ask the next obvious question, which is, well, if they're not coming down and they're just taking advantage of the fact they were able to create a new price level, shouldn't the government do something about that? Of course, he didn't ask that.
Well, the economy in the United States, they've had job-busting numbers, so they're creating more jobs right now. In Canada, we're losing jobs, apparently. And yeah. I would suggest that we need in North America, including Mexico, is to increase our manufacturing capacity by at least 50% if we're going to have climate-based supply chain issues, war issues. We might not be able to get stuff from China down the road, but getting China into the economy was actually one thing Nixon did right, I would suggest. Getting them to be part of the world, right?
Yeah. I agree.
And I'd like to thank Paul Jay for being part of our telecast, our video, our YouTube. And please check out the Analysis.News. You can find on YouTube, and I think there's a webpage.
Our webpage. Yeah, go to the webpage. The Analysis.News.
Go to the webpage. Okay. So thank you very much, Paul. You're an icon, and we appreciate you, buddy.
Icon.
You are.
You're my icon. Okay.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye.